Today, we return to the story of Joseph and his brothers, except with an aspect that we haven't had occasion to consider previously, and that is what takes place in particular in Genesis chapter 38. So we recall at the end of chapter 37, we read the sorry tale of Joseph's sale into slavery in Egypt. In verse 28, and they passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. And the sale, final sale, verse 36, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's, the captain of the guard. And in a glaringly repetitive manner, Genesis chapter 39 begins on much the same footing. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hand of the Ishmaelites that had brought him down there. Why the repetition? Well, of course, we can readily appreciate the reason for the repetition, all of chapter 38 in the middle. Chapter 38 serving as an astonishing digression that has nothing to do at all with the story of Joseph's sale as a slave to Egypt. So naturally, if the end of chapter 37 was truncated and the narrative picks up again after a very lengthy chapter that has nothing to do with it, it's not surprising that chapter 39 gives us a kind of recapitulation to remind us of where we were. Well, where are we in Genesis chapter 38? At the beginning of the chapter we read, and it came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren and turned in to a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. And Judah saw their daughter of a certain Canaanite, perhaps better rendered, merchant, whose name was Shua. And he took her and went in unto her marriage. And in the following three verses, in rapid fire succession, we read of the births of his three sons. And she conceived and bore a son, Er. And she conceived again and bore a son, Onan. And she yet again bore a son, Shelah. So far, a perfectly ordinary description of Judah starting a family. Except that in the continuation of the chapter, we realize that the ordinary progression becomes abruptly derailed. That while verse 6 apprises us, and Judah took a wife for Er, his firstborn, and here we are introduced to the identity of Tamar, the wife. Er dies. Judah then says to Onan, second son, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother unto her. The reference, of course, being to Leviratical marriage, about which we read in Deuteronomy, to raise up seed for your brother. And for whatever reason, Onan is uncooperative, and he too dies. Whereupon at this point, in verse 11, Judah says to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, is grown up. The progression again being the surviving brother marrying his deceased brother's widow, what again is in Hebrew, yibum, in English, Leviratical marriage. But Scripture tells us that Judah's advice to Tamar was really tantamount to, let's just part ways, goodbye. For he said, lest he also die like his brethren. Things aren't working out with Tamar, so why don't you just remain a widow in your father's house? So far, the progression is, while indeed under extraordinary circumstances, fairly ordinary. Getting married, having children, extraordinary circumstances. The children die. But the reaction is within the bounds of what was accepted practice, perfectly ordinary. And then comes an abrupt, baffling shift that when Tamar is told this after Judah's own wife has passed on, that she has an opportunity to get hold of Judah. We read in verse 14 of the intrigue. She put off from her the garments of her widowhood and covered herself with her veil and wrapped herself and sat in the entrance of Enaim, or at the crossroads, which is by the way of Timnah, disguising herself, as becomes clear in the following verse, as a harlot, in order to attract the attention of the widowed Judah. So he's a widower, she's a widow. Of course, she is a widow by his son. Under normal circumstances, we would regard that as an incestuous relationship. But she contrives to attract Judah's attention, and he turned unto her by the way, verse 16, saying, come, I pray you, let me come in unto you, not knowing that she was his daughter-in-law. And as we read in verse 18, the culmination of this episode is that Judah came to Tamar not knowing that it was his daughter-in-law, and she conceived by him. She is bearing his child. In verse 24, we read that it came to pass about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law has committed harlotry, and she is with child by harlotry. And the initial reaction of Judah, based upon, presumably, the obligation that Tamar would have to wait for Shelah in the context of this Leviratical marriage with her deceased husband's brother, that what she has done is tantamount to an act of adultery. Bring her forth, let her be burnt. When she was brought forth, in verse 25, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whose these are, referring to what Judah had given her on the day of their union, the pledges. The one to whom these objects belonged is the father. By the man whose these are, am I with child. She doesn't say anything more explicit than that. She is, when all is said and done, risking her very life, not to mention that of the unborn child as it emerges, children within her. Discern, I pray you, whose are these, the signet and the cords and the staff. And Judah acknowledged them and said, One possible translation is, she is more righteous than I, or perhaps even more overtly, she is right. It is from me. I'm the Father. In either case, clearly accepting, acknowledging, admitting. For as much as I gave her not to Shelah, my son, it's my responsibility. So considering what we read in the foregoing, besides our having already realized that the circumstances unfolding here are extraordinary, here the conduct of the two principal characters in each case is extraordinary. Altogether, Tamar's conduct in contriving to have relations with Judah because of, evidently, a burning desire to bear his children, a deep appreciation of the cosmic, extraordinary significance of the descendants of Judah, as we will yet see. This realization prompts her to extraordinary behavior. Extraordinary behavior not only in the very act of contriving to have relations with him, but also the extraordinary manner in which she reacts to what, in the absence of Judah's admission, would be a death sentence. And of course, simultaneously, likewise, Judah's extraordinary behavior. Extraordinary in that it would certainly be the most natural thing to expect of someone of his stature. After all, he's being regarded as judge in this case, isn't he? To remain silent. And he doesn't. He does take responsibility. He does make admission, confession. So Judah, too, is an extraordinary actor here. And the consequence of the extraordinary conduct of both Judah and Tamar is what we then read beginning in verse 27 of the births. And it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass, when she travailed, that one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, this came out first. Evidently, already anticipating at this point that there are twins involved. And came to pass, we read in verse 29, as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. And she said, wherefore have you made a breach for yourself? Bursting forth, the Hebrew, Peretz. Therefore his name was called Peretz. And afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zerach. Now, of course, here, manifestly, we're reading an extraordinary narrative. Under normal circumstances, the child whose birth begins first is usually the one who emerges first. Well, in this case, of course, it is Zerach who begins to be born first. He's the one who puts out his hand. But he isn't born first, because then Peretz bursts forth on the scene. And Zerach, in the end, is born after Peretz. Now, all this is a bewildering story in its own right. We might regard it as mildly quaint, interesting. I don't know what adjective to apply here. We certainly aren't going to merely regard it as the recounting of historical events, simply because, number one, we realize the Torah doesn't by any means strive to give us an exhaustive accounting of historical events. We don't read any similar stories about any of the other brothers. And perhaps more importantly, we've noted this on many occasions. The word Torah means teaching. It's not a history book. It's not a science book. It's a book of teaching us how to live. This narrative is inevitably placed here for that reason, because it teaches us how to live. Of course, inevitably, that places all the more so the responsibility upon us to understand what it's teaching, what it's for. So in attempting to address this question, of course, the first point to appreciate is that while we might regard this as an interesting, extraordinary story in any family, this is not the story of any family. What we learn, of course, only much later in the Bible, but what casts critical light on our understanding of Genesis chapter 38 is that, in fact, what we are reading here is the story of the dawning, if you will, of the light of the Messiah. Peretz, in the genealogy that we read at the end of the book of Ruth, is specifically the one who is presented as the first name in the lineage. The lineage that begins with Peretz and continues with Chetzron, Ram, Aminadav, Nachshon, Salmon, Boaz, Oved, and Yishai, Jesse. Of course, his son is King David. So, the lineage here is by no means something incidental or prosaic. The lineage is the lineage of the Messiah. And as for the initial question that inevitably arises when we consider chapter 38 of Genesis, why altogether do we need to know about this story? We discern here not merely the answer that this is an important story, because it is, after all, the circumstances of the birth of the progenitor of the Messiah. On a deeper plane, we consider the context. Again, Genesis chapter 37 on the one hand, Genesis chapter 39 on the other. On both sides of chapter 38, a description of the circumstances that are leading to the first exile. The first member of the household of Israel, Joseph, son of Jacob, who is forcibly removed from the Holy Land, from the land of Israel, to go into exile. And of course, it's not merely the story of the individual, because Joseph's descent to Egypt is the ominous point of initiation of what we well know will eventually be the descent of Jacob and his entire family to Egypt. So the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37 and Genesis chapter 39 is the story of the beginning of the first exile. And in this regard, can't help but consider an ancient tradition commenting on Genesis chapter 38 in the middle. On the one hand, what's taking place all around chapters 37 and 39 is confusion, ruin, the sale of Joseph. Joseph is in mourning. Jacob is in mourning. The whole family has been torn asunder. And Judah goes and starts a family. So in this scene, we envision Joseph is preoccupied with his mourning over what's happened to him. Jacob is preoccupied with his mourning over what's happened to him. Judah, preoccupied with starting his family. And I share with you what the culmination of this assessment is in our tradition. And God, as it were, is engaged at this time in creating the light of the Messiah. And as a kind of synopsis, here we have Joseph embarking on a path of exile, the point of initiation of the first exile. And as the first exile is only beginning to get underway, we're reading about the roots of the final Redeemer. The final Redeemer, the descendant of King David, the Messiah. So, of course, this at the very least gives us some sense of the significance of the narrative of which we read here. But we still need to understand what the narrative is telling us, and in particular, what the circumstances of the birth of Peretz tell us with respect to that promised Redeemer, the ultimate redemption, the coming of the Messiah. And I want to remind you again, there was so much extraordinary in this story. The circumstances are extraordinary enough, but what's of utmost importance for us is the extraordinary conduct of the principals, behaving in a way that really contravenes what we would normally expect of mere human nature. Mere human nature. First of all, Tamar wouldn't have gotten herself embroiled in this whole business. But she sensed there is something critical in her union with the family of Judah. And if it's not going to be with Judah's sons, let it be with Judah himself. Judah's extraordinary conduct, certainly contravening human nature, putting himself in a very awkward position of admitting less than laudable conduct and saving Tamar and his unborn children. And then the extraordinary conduct, as it were, of Peretz himself. The birth process has already begun. There's a normal, natural birth process taking place, and Peretz upsets it. Peretz, the very name, breaking forth, bursting out. There in the womb, he is circumscribed, enclosed, and he breaks out. There is an implicit dynamism here of not accepting the normal run of things, what we would expect under natural circumstances. There's something unnatural, extraordinary, even supernatural. And it's interesting to consider how this idea is intimated in a very different place in Scripture. We turn to Psalm 89. Before we consider the actual message in Psalm 89, upon which I'd like to focus here, I feel compelled to share with you another ancient tradition, a very deep esoteric tradition. We could even describe it, in a way, as Kabbalistic, from one of the oldest works of esoteric Torah understanding. So listen carefully to this. There are two sons born in this description to the union of Tamar and Judah. There is Zerach and there is Peretz. The name Zerach means shining, which of course, on the most obvious plane, is an allusion to the scarlet thread. Remember, the midwife tied on his hand a scarlet thread before the hand was withdrawn back into the womb. Keep it shining in this esoteric tradition. Alludes to the sun. The sun, after all, is always shining. And what of Peretz? Peretz is something else. Peretz, I already noted, translated here as making a breach, perhaps better, more rigorously rendered as bursting forth, breaking through a boundary. The same root, the same verb, can also be applied to the moon. The moon as it goes through its phases. The moon wanes, that's called nifratz, nifretzet, being broken down, and the moon waxes. It is periodically broken down and built up. And while Zerach is named for the sun, Peretz, progenitor of King David, progenitor of the Messiah, is named for the moon. Now, the metaphor of the moon isn't something that is merely invented in this esoteric statement, and that's the reason that we're looking at Psalm 89. Because Psalm 89 includes this passage that is, as it were, directed to King David and his everlasting dynasty after him. In verse 21, I have found David my servant, with my holy oil have I anointed him. My covenant, in verse 35, will I not profane, nor alter that which is gone out of my lips. Once have I sworn by my holiness, surely I will not be false unto David. His seed, verse 37, shall endure forever. Metaphor number one, and his throne as the sun before me. Metaphor number two, in verse 38, it shall be established forever as the moon, and be steadfast as the witness in the sky. First the sun, then the moon. Now, in considering what the message is that emerges in Psalm 89, these metaphors, in particular the progression between them, should undoubtedly give us pause. After all, that the sun signifies sovereign in nature, mastery of nature. The root basis of all of nature is something that should be clear to all of us. All natural processes on earth, on one level or another, we trace back to the sun. The wind, the rains, the various cycles of life, everything ultimately depends upon the sun. With that central, overriding significance of the sun, doesn't it seem awfully anticlimactic? Immediately after, in verse 37, speaking of his throne being as the sun before me, to then invoke the metaphor of the moon. The moon, it doesn't even have its own light. It just reflects sunlight. The moon, as the high note in the crescendo, that, it would seem, trumps the sun. And yet, consider the expression here. His throne as the sun before me, it shall be established forever as the moon. That stress upon being established forever as the moon arguably gives a preeminence to the moon that isn't even given in the previous verse to the sun. What's so special about the moon? Again, the sun has dominion in nature. But the moon represents dynamism, always moving, never simply continuing the old course, something new. Of course, on an astronomical plane, from our perspective on Earth, the role, the significance of the sun from our perspective remains basically the same. Nothing really changes when we think about the sun. Indeed, small wonder that in Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 9, we read, that which has been is that which shall be, and that which has been done is that which shall be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes doesn't say there's nothing new under the moon, because the moon is all about newness. You look at the moon, 2 adjacent nights, and you see something different each night. The moon progressing through its phases that obviously signify the ongoing motion of the moon, its position relative to the sun-earth system continuously changing. From our earthly perspective, the moon indeed represents dynamism, flux, motion. The moon signifies something then that the sun lacks. Again, there's nothing new under the sun, but in Exodus chapter 12, the very first commandment that is given to Moses and Aaron on behalf of the emergent nation of Israel is, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months. Initiation, beginning. Why am I stressing that aspect of the month? Well, because, of course, the unit of time, the month, is based upon nothing other than the moon. In the English, of course, it's patently obvious that the word month is derived from moon, which it is. In Hebrew, one of the words for month is yerach, for the Hebrew experts among you, you undoubtedly sense the association of Yerach with Yareach, one of the words for the moon. The other more common word for month in Hebrew is Chodesh. Chodesh, coming from the root of Chadash, new, because every month is something new. Again, we're always seeing the moon from a new perspective. So it's one thing to praise David and his dynasty as being like the sun. But there's something that is far more valuable, far more significant when we liken David and his dynasty specifically to the moon. It's especially significant because we recognize what the dynasty of King David is all about, is precisely the themes and motifs about which we've read in Genesis chapter 38. Always in flux, dynamic, never just sitting there passively. And furthermore, there's that extraordinary element that goes beyond what would normally be the constrained course of nature, of history. In Amos chapter 9, verse 11, in that day will I raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, and close up the breaches thereof. And I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old. So inevitably, question that arises in addressing a verse like this is, why is David's dynasty called a tabernacle in the Hebrew? Sukkah, Sukkat David. Generally speaking, we refer to dynasties as houses. You know, House of Orange, House of Windsor. We speak of houses, not tabernacles, not a sukkah. So please listen carefully, because this is a very, very deep thought by one of our most profound thinkers, scholars, the Maharal, Rabbi Judah Loewy of Prague in the 16th century. House is the appropriate designation for something that is rooted, that is anchored in this world. Something that has firm foundations in this world. That's the appropriate way of designating every dynasty on the planet, except one. The dynasty of David isn't rooted in the physical world. The dynasty of David is rooted in the world of the spirit. So inevitably, its presence in this world doesn't strike us as something permanent, as something that's really anchored here, but rather something that is only transitory in this world, a temporary dwelling. Temporary dwelling is tabernacle. A temporary dwelling is indeed a sukkah. So the dynasty of David is described as a sukkah. And furthermore, anything that is anchored firmly in this world is, of course, as we discussed in other contexts, subject to the physical laws of disintegration and decay. So all those other houses are indeed transitory. They ultimately degenerate and disappear. But the dynasty of David which is anchored in the realm of the spirit. It's not a house, it's just a sukkah. But then it also isn't subjected to the physical laws of decay that pertain to this world. Rather, on the contrary. A sukkah, as you may well know, a sukkah is a fairly flimsy dwelling. It comes apart very easily, but since it comes apart very easily, it's also very easy to put it back together again. When a house falls, it has to be rebuilt. When a sukkah falls, you just stand up the walls again. Because it transcends the bounds of this worldliness. It is extraordinary. It goes beyond nature. Beyond nature in the same vein that King David's progenitors, Judah and Tamar, went beyond nature. And their son Peretz, progenitor of King David, progenitor of the Messiah, likewise personified that going beyond nature. Nature would dictate that Zerach started to be born, and Zerach should be born first. But there's something else, something extraordinary. Peretz breaks forth. Nature doesn't hold sway here. To be part of that message of King David, of the Messiah, necessarily entails being proactive, going beyond. And it's not just about King David and his dynasty. This is actually something that we discern much earlier on in the progenitors of Israel. We've noted this in the past. The same extraordinary conjugation, hit halech, which is probably best rendered as walk oneself. So, for Abraham, in Genesis chapter 17, verse 1, hit halech is the imperative. God says to Abraham, hit halech lefanai, walk before me. You go first. You take the initiative. Not you're taking the initiative because you're in business for yourself. You take the initiative because that's God's charge to you to take the initiative. Whereas, in contrast, in the case of Noah, Scripture tells us in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, Noah walked with God, which is pretty good, especially when one considers his contemporaries. He is, after all, called righteous and wholehearted, but walking with God isn't the same as walking before God. The summons, the challenge, the charge is to take the initiative. And it's not just King David. It's the message that Abraham bequeaths to all his progeny, to all of us. And maybe in an even broader sense, we noted this some time ago. This is the send-off of the story of creation. The very end of the story of creation, Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it because that in it he rested, he ceased from all his work that God created to do. In the Hebrew, lasot, to do. In Hebrew or in English, the word seems totally unnecessary. That God created, period. Who needs to do? Yeah, but everything that God created, he created to do. It's not supposed to merely be a matter of a passive world in which we kind of sit back and watch the view. You know, like you go to the cinema to see the movie, you're on the stage. Everything that God created, he created to do, to keep on doing, to initiate. There's a poignant postscript on that summons of all of the work, all the creative labor that God had created to do. Where do we find the culmination of that doing? The culmination is when we read in the Hebrew, Vatishlam kol hamalacha, all of the work, all of the creative labor was complete. When is that? That is when King Solomon, descendant, of course, of King David, completes the Holy Temple. Now, the building of the Holy Temple is, of course, by no means mere human initiative. It is a commandment of God to us in the Torah. They shall make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst. In Exodus chapter 25. So certainly the construction of the sanctuary is by no means some kind of human initiative on its own, but simultaneously there is a very definite emphasis here. The completion of the work of creation is when man takes the initiative in creating sacred space, endowed with holiness. When King Solomon completes the house of God, then he's resonating with that initial summons. Everything that God creates, he creates to do. Not merely to accept nature as a given, as the be-all and end-all of all things, but rather merely as a starting point. Because ultimately, what we do in fulfillment of God's charge is up to us. That's the initiative that God expects of us. And that indeed is what informs our understanding of a critically important blessing. In the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that this blessing is part of the reading in synagogues from the prophets on the Sabbath that takes place during the holiday of Hanukkah. So we will be reading these verses in synagogues throughout the world this coming Sabbath. The blessing to Joshua, the high priest. In our common count, it's Zechariah chapter 3, verse 6. In many of your Bibles, since chapter 3 begins elsewhere, it's not verse 6, but again, the specific count is immaterial, the content of the verses. The angel of God forewarned Joshua, saying, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, if you will walk in my ways, and if you will keep my charge, and will also judge my house, and will also keep my courts, then I will give you walkers among these standing ones." Now, it's a cryptic verse by any measure, which is what prompts the alternative translations here. I'm translating as literally as possible. I will give you walkers among these standing ones. What does it mean? Who are the walkers? What are the standing ones? As you had occasion to know, I believe in the past as well. In Ezekiel chapter 1, we get an elucidation of what the standing ones are. In verse 7, speaking of the angels, their legs were straight. In verse 9, they turned not when they went. They went, everyone, straight forward. Angels are the standing ones. Angels are the standing ones because they don't go. They don't grow. They don't move. Man is the walker. Man is always going. Man is always growing. Never content with merely being passive. This is precisely the summons for all the human condition that is so vividly encapsulated in the story of Judah and Tamar and Peretz. As expressed in Job chapter 5, man is born to labor. As the flying beings fly upward. Flying beings, again, can refer to the angels. They fly upward. Man is here to labor. In this world, there is so much always left to do. And inevitably, In considering that theme, so much left to do, we conclude with one critical final note. As you all know, we are currently celebrating the Festival of Lights, the holiday of Hanukkah. It's not a biblical holy day, so we're not dedicating one of the sessions now to the biblical holy day of Hanukkah, but I do feel compelled, at the very least, to mention it. It is, after all, mentioned in the books of the Apocrypha, the story of the Chashmonaim from the 2nd century before the Common Era. The story of Hanukkah. The conflict between the Chashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, and the Hellenists. And it pertains, I think, directly to everything that we've been saying this evening. As you know, Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, we kindle the lights of Hanukkah every evening for 8 nights. Just a few hours ago, I lit our Hanukkah menorah here at home, and the message of kindling the light here also is you need to take initiative. With respect to the menorah, as God commands Moses in Exodus chapter 27, verse 20, you have to command the children of Israel to bring pure olive oil, to cause a lamp to burn continually. You need to illuminate what, by mere course of nature, would remain cold, dark, bleak world. You need to take the initiative. And when you take that initiative, you appreciate the light you shine is light that indeed illuminates all the world. In Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6, I, God, have called you in righteousness, and have taken hold of your hand, and kept you, and set you for a covenant of the people, for a light of the nations. In chapter 49, verse 6, he said, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the offspring of Israel. I will also give you for a light of the nations, that my salvation may be unto the end of the earth. And chapter 60, arise, shine, for your light is come. Nations shall walk at your light, and kings at the brightness of your shining. Summons to illuminate the world. And indeed, concomitantly, as stressed in these verses repeatedly, that message of divine glory. You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Again, in chapter 60, the glory of God is shown upon you. His glory shall be seen upon you. That divine glory is something that you need to earn. You need to earn the opportunity to broadcast that glory by not merely being subservient to the dictates of nature, the impersonal dictates of an indifferent fate. Some of you have heard me make this observation in the past, but I feel compelled to share it with you now as well because it is so directly germane to what we're discussing. Judaism versus Hellenism. Both have a story to describe to us how fire comes into the world. According to the ancient Greeks, how did fire come into the world? By agency of Prometheus. Who was Prometheus? Prometheus the Titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to man, and as reward for his efforts, he is bound to a mountain to have his liver pecked out every day, only to have it grow back so it can be pecked out again the following day. Eternal torment for having had the audacity to steal fire from the gods and give it to man. And in Judaism, this is not, admittedly, explicit in Scripture, but it is an ancient tradition that fire was one of those things that could have been created in the 6 days, whatever days mean here, of divine creation. But instead, God defers fire to the end of the Sabbath of creation, whereupon, when night falls, God bestowed upon man an intellect, a mind, as a reflection of the heavenly model, whereupon man took 2 stones and struck them against one another and produced a spark. And of course, it's important for us to appreciate that there are 2 critical differences in that portrayal of the origin of fire with respect to the Greek narrative. Now, of course, the obvious difference is that in the Greek narrative, fire was stolen from the gods, and in our tradition, fire is a gift from God himself. But there's an additional difference. This additional difference is more subtle, but maybe, perhaps, even more important. What was the gift from God? It wasn't fire. It was a mind capable of producing fire. Not merely to be the passive recipient to derive benefit from divine largesse, to take everything that God gives us. It's much deeper than that. The greatest gift that God gives us is the opportunity to indeed be active, to do extraordinary things, to transcend the bounds of nature. The conquest of fire is just such an act, historically. To transcend the bounds of nature. To do it not in order to attain self-aggrandizement, but rather to become more good, godly human beings. God's summons for us is not merely to passively submit, but rather to actively bear the torch, to hearken to the charge that God gives us, to be active. That which is so brilliantly encapsulated in the biography of Peretz and his parents. That initiation, that's the divine summons from each and every one of us, ultimately. And that is a lesson, of course, that emerges from Genesis chapter 38. But considering this, then, there is one additional nuance that I feel compelled to stress that brings us clear back to the beginning of the story, and with this we conclude. A subtle but edifying point, that when we consider what indeed we read in Exodus chapter 39, in the description of what happens to Joseph, and compare that with the beginning of it, Genesis chapter 38, what happens with Judah. In Genesis chapter 39, Joseph was brought down to Egypt. He was bought passively of the hand of the Ishmaelites that had brought him down there. So subtly, but so critically. In the case of Judah, Judah went down from his brethren. No one is bringing him. He was going on his own. That message of being active, that message indeed of recognizing the divine charge. In that vein, if you will, to conclude, returning to that final note of Isaiah chapter 60, with which we just concluded, it is instructive to note what indeed is the divine summons that the prophet communicates to us. It's for us, he tells us in the opening verse, to shine, for your light is come. But the goal of it all, as expressed in Isaiah chapter 60, verse 3, is nations shall walk at your light, and kings at the brightness of your shining. To teach the entire world to walk. To not merely be the standing ones, but to be the walkers. To be proactive. To be the means, indeed, for actualizing God's mission in the world. To heed his charge and to get to work. God bless you.